What do you think when you hear the word imperialism? The British Empire? The USA? Star Wars? While all of these could be a correct answer, there is one thing these three have in common. They are well known. Then there's the imperialism that isn't well known. From where? The Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China. Don't let the communist label fool you. This video isn't going too deep into an event in 1989 or those re-education camps. In this video, I'll go over the brutality of the Soviet Union and the CCP and their imperial past, and why a specific country is still at risk. Let's get started.
Okay, standing by for start in the sky. Reinforcements have arrived. Understood. Target locked and ready. Target destroyed.
When General Zhukov's army encircled the 6th German Army in Stalingrad, it was a turning point of the whole war and history itself. With landings in Africa, Italy, and France, the Axis lines were being pushed back rapidly. Europe was cut into two spheres of influence, and they couldn't be any more different. Western Europe was liberated from the Axis, and Eastern Europe was occupied by the Soviet Union. German occupation became Soviet occupation. When discussing their time under Soviet rule, I believe those Eastern Europeans, instead of those Westerners who think the USSR is their utopia. Anyways, after Russia pulled out of World War I, new countries like the Baltic states and an independent Ukraine were created. The Central Powers demanded land concessions from the Russian Empire due to their surrender. And that is where these countries got their independence. Then the Russian Civil War happened, and the communists were victorious. During all of that chaos, Ukraine was invaded by the Reds, but not in 2014 or 2022. It was another invasion in 1919. I wonder why Ukraine doesn't want to be under Russian occupation today. Let's move on to World War II. On August 23, 1939, Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. This pact was a non-aggression pact so that both of them could divide Europe into their spheres of influence, specifically Poland. Poland was jointly invaded by both the Germans and the Soviets, who split Poland in two. The Germans sent Jews and Gypsies to death camps, and Poles were brought to gulags and work camps in Siberia. 84,000 Polish people, most of them innocent, were sent to rot and do the Soviets' dirty work for them. And that is just the amount we know. The actual numbers would be much higher. Poland has had an extremely dark history, and that's an understatement. The Cat Massacre was one of the most horrifying mass execution stories known to man. 22,000 Polish prisoners of war were executed in cold blood. When the Germans were retreating from the Soviets, the Polish people staged an uprising in Warsaw, known as the Warsaw Uprising. The city was subsequently turned into a wasteland by the retreating Germans. Okay, that is horrifying enough, but wait. Weren't the Soviets right behind them to liberate and help them? Well, yes, they were. But they weren't there to liberate them. They were there to occupy and weaken Poland so it could be under the grip of communism. The Red Army stopped at the gates of Warsaw and waited for the Germans to finish their terror campaign in Warsaw. The Soviets promised them aid, but none was given. The Allies offered to help by supplying Poland using Soviet air bases, but the Soviets refused. They refused. The Allies opened a second front in France. Their Lend-Lease gave the Soviets the hardware and the materials needed to push back the Germans. Neutral Iran was invaded by the British and the Soviets to open a supply route via the Caucasus, but they refused. Terrible. The Soviet Union preached its anti-fascist and anti-imperialist beliefs. However, they not only occupied Eastern European countries post-war, but did so for nearly 50 more years, until the USSR collapsed. The reasoning for the liberation of these countries is always met with statements like, "Those were Russian lands," or "We have cultural ties." That sounds like imperialism to me. Okay, now obviously, the Allies fighting with the Soviets is what won the war. It was an enemy of my enemy is my friend situation. No, the Soviets aren't imperialists because they defended themselves from Germany. The Germans did sadistic things to the Slavs. They are imperialists for how they trashed Europe, which was meant to be liberated from the Axis. They are imperialists for agreeing to carve up Poland with the Germans and entirely invading Poland and making it a satellite state of the Soviet Union. The alliance with the Soviets was instrumental in defeating the Germans. That cannot be understated. But in doing so, it left a scar on Europe for nearly 50 years, and it still has its effects to this day. But it was the only choice the world had. In conclusion, the Soviet Union is no better than the Western imperialist powers they painted as their enemy. Their violent and rapid expansion into Europe is often viewed as an occupation and a war of conquest instead of a liberation. The horror stories on how Soviet troops treated the civilians, mostly in Germany, is absolutely sickening. No country was innocent in this aspect, but the level of the Soviets' reign of terror is unfathomable. Just look up Soviet occupation of Berlin, and you will be horrified. But in this country, looking up something about their violent history is forbidden. Something that doesn't often get mentioned is just how dark the 1900s were for the Chinese. The number of deaths in World War II was over 20 million. Most of them were civilians. They were the subject of a bloody civil war, which was interrupted by one of the most brutal invasions in history. The Chinese Civil War was halted to fight the invasion together? Together. Funny. The PRC was conducting guerrilla warfare, sure. But in reality, instead of helping fend off the Japanese with all their might, they opted to strengthen themselves for when the Civil War resumed. The Japanese committed some of the worst war crimes imaginable against the Chinese people. Biological weapons, rape houses, and the Nanjing Massacre are a few examples of these crimes. The fact that they didn't fully defend their country when their people were being massacred is an extremely telling story. Their strength was built, and after World War II ended, the Chinese Civil War started back up. The communists rapidly defeated the depleted and war-ravaged nationalists who fled to Taiwan. On October 1st, 1949, Mao Zedong established the People's Republic of China, and a new Chinese age began. Nearly a year later, they invaded Buddhist Tibet. At the time, it was independent. The war lasted for less than a month. 100,000 Tibetans fled to neighboring India, where the government sits in exile. The CCP destroyed countless numbers of religious sites like monasteries. 9 years later, in 1959, The Tibetans rose against the PRC, and as a result, 87,000 Tibetans became casualties of the occupation. Women were sent to prison, tortured, and executed. And there were also more Tibetans who were sent to rot in Chinese prison camps. In today's world, Tibet has no freedom of speech or religion. Over 1.2 million out of 6 million Tibetans have been killed due to Chinese occupation. Let's move on to another Chinese province, Xinjiang. Xinjiang was taken over with minimal bloodshed, but the effects of Uyghurs living under Chinese occupation are horrifying. Just recently, a leak in the Chinese state police released some mugshots of over 5,000 Uyghurs who were detained for their faith. Unlike the Han Chinese in the East, Uyghurs have a Turkic origin and practice Islam. Images and rumors out of these camps are things you thought would never happen again. Imprisonment and sterilization just because of their faith and race. That sounds very similar to something else. I just can't put my finger on it. There will always be denial in Beijing about these camps. But as time goes on, keeping these camps secret will get more and more complex. It doesn't help that the province of Xinjiang is chock full of natural gas reserves, which is needed for China's massive population. In this case, the Uyghurs and the presence of natural gas made Xinjiang highly vital to the PRC to control, at any cost. Han Chinese have been moving in droves to both Xinjiang and Tibet, while the CCP has worked on destabilizing Xinjiang. To this day, both Tibetans and Uyghurs are oppressed heavily. Even in Western countries, they are the subject of harassment. The PRC also has its eye on another territory they call an internal issue: Taiwan. I've talked about Taiwan in my Cold War video and how that invasion might play out. If you want to hear more about it, I'll link that video down below. Taiwan has never been recognized as independent by Beijing. China wants to take over Taiwan, and there is one main reason I failed to mention in my previous video: microprocessors or semiconductors. These little chips are the key to technology around the world. Your iPhone has one, your TV has one, refrigerators, laptops, modern cars, and so on. Taiwan manufactures 92% of all the world's semiconductors. 92% of the world. Apple is the largest consumer of these chips, giving the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, TSMC, 405 billion USD in revenue. If China gains control of the TSCM through an invasion, they could absolutely cripple massive corporations and countries alike. While we're still on the subject of Taiwan, a significant issue has been the disregard of their exclusive economic zone, or EEZ. Actually, China doesn't respect any of its neighbors' EEZs. Beijing points their fingers at the West for patrolling their territorial waters. Okay, sure, Mr. 9-Line. I don't care if this was written on any old map. You can't just go and own the South China Sea. The South China Sea is a hotspot for fishing and extracting natural resources. It's also precious and essential to those countries surrounding it. Not just China. Mysterious islands are popping up with military bases around the sea. Where from? China. To do what? Force their 9-Line claim of the South China Sea. Again, it sounds very imperialist to me. If their goal is to anger every country in the South China Sea, it's working. And if China wants to get beyond these island chains, they have to manufacture closer relationships with those same countries, not anger them. Okay, I have to throw this in here. China helped build the African headquarters building in Ethiopia. Wow, that's great! Of course. I'm not surprised that they did this, and I'm definitely not surprised that they're lying about it. All that aside, an invasion of Taiwan would turn the world upside down. And with the US clearly telling Beijing that they would defend Taiwan, we have no idea what our future could look like. The Soviets horrified an already war-ravaged Europe, but putting countries behind the Iron Curtain. The PRC set up prisons that look like concentration camps to oppress their Uyghur population. We can't predict the future, but if China decides to invade Taiwan, the whole world could be at war. Once again. This is Conflict Untangled, and I'll see you for the next one.